Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, Episode 40, Czar Alexander I of Russia, Napoleon's most powerful foe. We have a special guest once again. We have our good friend Alexander Mikaberidze from LSU Shreveport. Say hello, Alex.
Hello. Thank you.
Yeah, hey, thanks for coming on.
I guess I'm doing something right that you've invited me back.
I invite you back because I can pronounce your name well now.
So. And you're doing it so well.
Thank you, buddy. Yeah, I'm getting better at it. Alexander, for my listeners, he's been on the show before. We did an episode on Barclay de Tolly and Kutuzov. And today I thought it'd be interesting. This is not necessarily a general, but we're going to dive into Czar Alexander, who's a very interesting man in his own right, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the most complex character of this entire period, the Sphinx of the North, as I think one of his biographers titled the book.
Yeah.
So, and a very interesting character.
And in terms of personal growth, I feel like he was one of the few characters who really grew and enhanced his reputation as the years went on.
Absolutely. I think the hard way, but he learned the lessons, at least the key lessons. Right. And ultimately, he is the one who triumphs over Napoleon. Although for a long time there, it looked like it would be the other way around.
Correct. Yeah. So, let's dive in. Can you kind of give us a brief sketch of what Alexander's life was growing up?
When he was born in 1777, on December 23rd, he was born into a family that was quite dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm.
A family that already has gone through a turmoil or two, including the murder or the assassination of the previous emperor, Peter III, the father of Paul, the grandfather of Alexander himself. And I think that event, the fact that the legitimate emperor was overthrown and replaced by his wife, who had barely any legitimate claims to the power, but was effectively put on the throne by the sheer force, military force led by some of her lovers, of course, will overshadow many of the things that will happen. And one of the interesting things was that Paul will kind of bear grudge against his mother. So the relationship between Paul and Catherine would remain tense throughout their life. Partly it is because of Paul's own character, eccentricity, the physical resemblance to his father continued to irritate Catherine. So every time she looked at him, she kind of remembered her own husband. And by all accounts, Peter was a jackass, right? Especially if you read Catherine's memoirs, which are self-serving, but nonetheless,
right.
Having a young, beautiful wife and not being interested in her certainly could not but rub your wife wrong way.
Yeah.
Anyways, so what happens then is that the Russian court, the Russian nobility, is kind of split into two centers, two kind of power centers. One is in St. Petersburg around the Catherines, and it is that kind of libertine, open, vivacious,
right,
kind of way of life. And then there is a rural estate near St. Petersburg called Gatchina, and that's where Paul lives. And at Gatchina, Paul established a ducal court because he's the Grand Duke of the Russian Empire. And it is a world away from the freewheeling court of St. Petersburg.
Right.
Gatchina is far more austere environment. It is more, I would say, pedantic, more militaristic, more oppressive. And here at Gatchina, Paul, in many respects, cultivates the memory of his father, who was effectively murdered by his mother.
Yeah.
And here he shares his father's admiration for all things Prussian. Gatchina becomes kind of famous for its Prussomania, Prussian style troops that Paul establishes here, troops that are equipped, clothed, and drilled in Prussian manner. The court itself is kind of organized in Prussian manner. And therefore, you have two different courts.
Right.
And this young boy, Alexander, is now growing, split between his grandmother and his father. And so when I look at him, I see, in many respects, a tragic figure who has to choose which role he performs.
Right.
There is one role he needs to perform when he's with his father, and a different kind of mask that he puts on when he's with his grandmother.
Yeah.
And he keeps shuttling back and forth.
That's so interesting because he, like you said, he went from one court where it was freewheeling and open ideas to another court where it was very conservative and stern and militaristic.
You don't want to be a teenager, 14, 15-year-old boy and kind of grappling with all of these political matters. And yet Alexander would have had to.
And also in his teenage years, which I think is interesting, is he got married at a very young age, correct?
He did, though I wouldn't say it's necessarily unusual.
Right.
You can find similar kind of experiences in happenings in early eras. Not the less. For, let's say, Peter the Great was also married young.
Yeah.
Marriage didn't work out. But here in this case, Alexander's case, I think he was 15 years old.
Correct.
When he's married Princess Louise of Baden. Now, in Russian society, whenever a member of the royal family married outside, right, a married foreigner, the foreigner was expected to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy and change her name.
Mm-hmm.
So same, that's what happened with Empress Catherine herself. Right, she was actually German, raised in German. She belonged to Anhalt-Zerbst family, and when she came to Russia, she converted, took the name of Catherine. So now this is what happens to 14-year-old Louise of Baden, who converts and becomes Elizabeth Alexeyevna. And so the marriage, I would say it has its ups and downs, like all marriages, I guess.
Right.
Alexander was not necessarily the most loyal of husbands. The couple will go on to have children, although no male offspring will be produced from this marriage. And Alexander will also have kind of shenanigans on the side.
Right.
But the couple was tender and caring for each other. I've read Elizabeth's letters, and they all full of kind of worry and concern for her husband. So I think the marriage worked for both sides.
Just moving on the story, though, he got married in 1793, and then 3 years later, Catherine dies, and Paul takes over as Tsar with Alexander Tsarevich. So this could only complicate, Alex and his dad's relationship, right?
Oh yeah, and I mean the complicate is a good word. November in mid-November 1796, everyone knew that Catherine had kind of struggled with poor health. Even before she drew her last breath, however, Paul rushed to the imperial court.
I bet he did.
Yeah, and the story goes that he rummaged through her papers and allegedly found the documents that were designed to remove him from succession, so had them disposed of, and then effectively became the emperor. Well, I have, again, as hard of a character as Paul is, I cannot but feel bad for him, because he's been waiting for this moment for over 30 years, and very patiently so. You can imagine hating somebody and waiting for them to die and them not dying for 30 years. Right?
Yeah. And now's his time. Like he does. He has reforms in mind. He has things he wants to do as Tsar, and he's probably very excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in many respects, Paul felt like a stranger in his own country because he despised many of the things that Catherine has done in the preceding 3 decades.
Mhm.
I don't believe he's the Mad Tsar. That's a mad black legend that is created by Catherine and her supporters later on.
Mhm.
I don't believe he's a mentally deranged brute, but there are a lot of interesting things about him, right? If you read the writings of Nikolai Sablukov, very interesting guy, later on went into exile to England and wrote his memoirs actually in English. So Sablukov, who knew Polk very well, spoke of him in very kind of kind terms. He describes him as a sincerely pious, really benevolent, generous, hater of falsehoods, always anxious to promote justice. And that's, I think, not the view that most people, certainly maybe the listeners, have of him. Right?
Mhm.
We usually kind of think of him as that irrational brute
Right.
that was bent on crushing everything. But even those who liked him, like Sablukov, do admit that Paul could be very impatient, and
Mhm.
that impatience led to ill temper, which then led to certain transgressions.
Mhm.
And then one of the, I think, flaws that Paul has is that he has a very clear sense of what czardom is about, what that notion of imperial rule is about.
Mhm.
And part of it for him is blind obedience to what he wants to do.
Right.
And whenever somebody pushes back, I mean, it really irritates and kind of angers him.
Right.
And in the reforms that you talked about, right, the changes that he has in mind, they come fast and furious, almost several hours after Catherine's death, almost overnight. Some of the changes that Paul did were actually rational and important changes.
Mhm.
He understood, for example, that Russian army was kind of burdened with too many superfluous officers, too many generals. There are hundreds of generals for an army when you need to have just a few dozen.
Mhm.
He believes that the Russian nobles have abused the loopholes to enrich and kind of self-serve themselves. And so his early reforms are actually reforms that emphasize military professionalism, accountability, or things that I think we nowadays take for granted, right?
Right.
But at the time, the fact that Paul's kind of single-handedly dismisses hundreds of officers, eliminates special privileges and loopholes,
Yep.
strikes down the patronage networks that for a long time allowed nobles to abuse the system, all that was scandalous, right?
Right.
And it
And
exacerbated public anxiety.
yeah, and it creates animosity amongst your officer corps against you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially those who are fired, right?
Mhm.
They find very little to like about Paul,
Mhm.
or the ones that are held accountable, or the ones that are punished for their transgressions. And Paul can be very exacting. In my biography of Kutuzov, I show that Kutuzov, as capable as he was and as close as he was to Paul, could be, I mean, or kind of one day could be praised for doing something and then hammered by Paul for doing something trivial. One
Right.
of the things, for example, that was that Paul was a micromanager, and he expected the senior generals to consult with him on every little minute thing.
Mhm.
He did kind of double down on censorship. He did start kind of regulating theater and press more rigorously than ever. And again, that comes in the wake of kind of the good days of Catherine.
Right.
That meant that within a very short period of time, Paul did alienate a lot of people.
All right. Well, let's bring in then amongst this alienation and upsetting of the norms of Russia, the second coalition in our first discussion of Napoleon and the French entering the fray. So we're talking second coalition. The French Revolution has been going on, gosh, almost 10 years now. And Paul decides to become involved with the second coalition.
The Russian decision to join the second coalition is interesting because the war that is now entering, seventh year, is not directly affecting Russian territory or Russian interests. In fact, if anything, Russia took full advantage of the revolutionary wars to further its own interests. The last Polish partition, right, took place within the context of these struggles against revolutionary Europe, revolutionary France, and it's completed in 1795. But then a couple of important things happened. One is that Napoleon's invasion of Egypt claims the Order of Maltese Knights
in Malta. Yeah,
the Grand Master of the Maltese Knights was Paul, and he really took that personally. Right, the fact that the order is displaced by the French. Then he increasingly was looking kind of with concern at the developments in Europe, where he genuinely believes in kind of this notion that becomes one of the fundamental principles of conservatism, of legitimacy. And he believes that what French are doing is illegitimate. It's contrary to the kind of divinely blessed order of things, and that France need to be confronted. And he decides to join the coalition, and he sends probably the best Russian general.
Oh yeah.
Of not just this time, probably ever.
Ever, yeah.
Alexander Suvorov to command not just the Russian army, but he was chosen as generalissimo of the coalition force sent to Italy. And that's an interesting choice in terms of the theater of war, because as your listeners remember, Italy was the very place where Napoleon cut his teeth, right? Napoleon established himself.
Right.
And now Suvorov is sent to undo what Napoleon has done.
Yeah, and he does a great job of that. In fact,
it's a brilliant job. And that's, I think,
he rolls over. He does very well. He beats several different French generals, and everything's going great until he gets to Switzerland and meets, his vanguard meets Massena.
The ancien regime, these old regime armies, were fully capable of confronting the French, and as 1799 shows, crushing them time and again. Suvorov is a brilliant general. He has a good army, both Russian and Austrian army. And with that army, he defeats some of the recognizable names on the French side. He starts with Scherer. He goes then to defeat MacDonald, Moreau, the battles of Trebia, battle of
Joubert.
Brilliant victories. That allow the Allies to reclaim virtually entire Italian peninsula in the span of 4 months. I mean, it's really astonishing success. But the downside is that the Austrians didn't do as well in Switzerland. They scored some success, some victories, but ultimately they're confronted by Massena at Zurich. And are defeated, which prompts the decision to send Suvorov, instead of invading South France, to Switzerland to shore up the coalition defenses there. Equally important is the fact that Austrians and Russians don't see eye to eye. They have clear disagreements on the future of Italy. Paul wants to restore what he considers legitimate governments, while in Italy, while Austrians were far more interesting and I would say self-serving in that, especially in places like Piedmont, where they were keen on aggrandizing themselves. And so that kind of split between Austria and Russia means that Suvorov is diverted, sent across the Alps, and ultimately this is where we can get into nitpicking. Whether he was defeated by Massena or whether he triumphantly marched across the mountains and made to safety.
Right.
But ultimately, the Russian army is recalled by Paul, who is absolutely disgusted by what has happened between him and Austrians. And with his withdrawal, the second coalition loses a crucial partner, which will make it very much harder for the coalition to prevail over the French.
So now, not only are generals alienated, but it appears maybe to some in the military, in the Russian military, that they lost or didn't do as well as they should have done against the French in the second coalition.
Absolutely. I think the war of the Second Coalition contribute to a lot of animosity in the Russian officer corps. Paul himself also kind of contributed to this animosity through, again, doubling down on the reforms by kind of creating very austere, um, environment in St. Petersburg. Which again, to not to beat the the dead horse again and again, but it's a contrast,
Right.
with the
Yeah.
Catherine, right?
Yeah.
And so anyone who lived, any nobleman who lived through the Catherine's time would have inadvertently, right, compared the harsh reality of 1800, 1801, living under Paul, to a far more relaxed atmosphere of just 4 or 5 years earlier.
Right.
And that meant that a group of noblemen decided that they had enough and began to conspire against Paul.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because this is always the controversial part, and we'll get back to our protagonist now. How involved in Alexander was famously accused by General Van Damme of I may have surrendered, but at least I've never been implicated in killing my father.
That's right.
Yeah. How involved was he? I've heard different things on this. I heard that he knew about it, but he told the plotters not to kill his dad, to just, arrest him. Others say that, he was totally involved and wanted to kill his father. What happened in that 1801 assassination of Tsar Paul?
We know quite a bit,
Okay.
because many of the participants wrote memoirs later on, and there's documentation that allows us to look into the development of this conspiracy. Um, the key reason for conspiracy is this weight of the Tsar's authority, authority that is applied very capriciously, arbitrarily. It's not that the nobles are complaining necessarily of the Tsar exercising his authority, but rather exercising it in unexpected, in arbitrary way, unpredictable way, which creates anxiety over one's own future. I think the British ambassador Charles Whitworth kind of talked about the emperor, Paul literally not being in his senses on occasions, and that, I think, would contribute to this growing perception of madness. Although, as I said, it's not necessarily true. And so what happens is a group of officers rally around individuals, senior individuals like Peter von Pahlen, Nikita Panin, and the Zubov brothers, as well as Generals Benningsen. Later on, right, we've talked about, I think, Benningsen, and he becomes kind of important figure in Alexander's own reign. And they agree that Paul needs to go, and that it will be much better for the nation, for the empire, and certainly for all of them, if Alexander, this young Grand Duke, replaces his father. Remember, this was already been done before, right? Peter III had been removed from power and paved the way.
Yeah. In Russian history, czars being killed, and the word czar, even for Caesar, it's very Roman. Like, you become czar, but there's a very good chance you may get assassinated before your before your natural time of death. Is that an unfair criticism of Russian czardom?
No, in all 18th century certainly shows that czardom is not kind of that absolute, this imperial institution that is unassailable.
Right.
That emperors could be removed, and they they can be replaced overnight. We've seen that happening, for example, in 1740. With Elizabeth coming to power through a coup. We see that in 1762 with Catherine coming through a coup. And now, effectively, in 1801, increased number of people are asking, why are we tolerating this jackass, right?
Well, Alexander, though, must have been conflicted, because it is his dad. So he's like, yeah, I'd love the job and I'd love to be czar, but I don't know if I want to kill my father.
But I think this is where we need to be clear that when the conspirators approached Alexander, they did not necessarily tell the Grand Duke that, hey, we're going to kill your father.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do have instances in Russian history when senior figures are encouraged to join a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
So you can remove the Tsar and send him to a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell him, hey, this is your retirement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what Alexander understood. So it's not the question that he was unaware of the plotting. Oh, no, he was well aware of the plotting. And he was aware that the conspirators were planning to put him on the throne.
Mm-hmm.
So he would have been quite excited about that. Now, the part where he was quibbles about it was, whether that was a kind of cool thing to do to your dad. He understood it was not.
Mm-hmm.
And he certainly was not in favor of doing any violence to his dad.
Mm-hmm.
He, as we'll see in a second, he was shocked by what happens to his dad.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find interesting is that, of course, he tacitly agrees to all of this. Right? He
Right.
listens to the conspirators. He nods. He says nothing to his father. There's clear evidence that he was perfectly fine with the conspiracy to move forward as long as his father is not violently kind of harmed.
Mm-hmm.
So the conspiracy ultimately involves at least 60 officers.
Wow.
Maybe as many as 200 individuals in total, but about 60 were at the core. And in March of 1801, they decide to strike. And what I find interesting is that Paul has kind of premonition about this. In fact, more than that, I'll tell you more than this. The guy who is running the conspiracy, you gotta love that part. The guy who is running the conspiracy is also kind of serving as the counterintelligence chief for Paul. And Paul hears the rumors of something is happening. People are meeting, right? And they're kind of quietly talking.
Right.
So one day he confronts this guy by the name of Panin. He confronts him and says, hey, what's going on? And Panin says, hey, Your Majesty, you're right. There is a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
A conspiracy against you. But don't worry. I have it under control. I'm watching it. I just want to see how many people are actually involved in it. Don't worry. We'll swoop in and we'll take, kind of arrest them.
Right.
So it's a weird situation where on one hand, Paul kind of has a sense that there is something happening, but he's assured time and again by people that he trusts,
Right.
the hunting guy, that he will be okay. That the intelligence will, the security forces will take care of it. And so just in case, Paul decides to move to a different place. So until now, he's been at the Royal Palace in St. Petersburg. In early 1801,
Mm-hmm.
he finished, not even completely finished, but still good enough, right? Finished the construction of a new St. Michael's Castle, and that place is really the kind of the royal complex that is more like a fortress than a palace.
Mm-hmm.
Imposing walls, wide moats, drawbridges. This is kind of, to me, when I look at this castle, it's a clear indication that Paul was concerned about safety, but thought that St. Michael's Castle
Was safe.
will
Yeah.
be safe.
Yeah.
So he moves in there, but he trusts this Panin and Palin, and Palin is particularly important because he's a governor general of St. Petersburg, and
Mm-hmm.
he's kind of in charge of
Security. Yeah.
And Palin is at the core of the conspiracy, and so on March 23rd, the Palin, Benningsen, the Zubov brothers, and others lead the conspirators to the castle. The men, the kind of the rank and file, right, of the conspiracy, were given alcohol to kind of overcome their trepidations and boost their morale.
Right.
So they rush into the palace, overpower the guards, and then get into the imperial bedroom, which famously is empty. And so for a moment, there is a panic. Some conspirators are panicking. Some begin to bewail the fact that we've been betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the story goes, one of them, usually credited with Benningsen says that the wine is poured and must be drunk.
Right.
That's it. We made we rolled the die. We have accepted it.
Yep.
And so he says, let's search the place more thoroughly. And as they're searching the place, they see these two little feet sticking beneath the screen in a corner of a room. And that's Paul, who is hiding, waiting for a moment for. The conspirators dragged Paul out. They demanded he sign abdication document. He refused. He began to berate the conspirators for daring to raise their hand on the emperor. A scuffle takes place, and in this scuffle, Paul is beaten very, very, very badly. Several men subdue him. Some bang him on his head on the floor. Others threw a sash around his neck and strangle him. And then once he's gonna dying, the conspirators then mangle his body. It's really a grisly scene.
Yeah.
Once this scene is kind of the dead body is there and they realize what they have done, Nikolai Zubov and Palin then go downstairs in the same castle. They go downstairs to meet Grand Duke Alexander. He's, of course, awake. And so Zubov opens the door, goes into the room, and some of the witnesses say that his face is flushed. It's either the excitement of what just happened or the wine that he was drinking. But anyway, Zubov kind of comes in and tells Alex, it is all over. We did it.
He becomes Tsar at a very young age, 23, and he's going to have to learn this new role that has just been thrust upon him, correct?
He absolutely.
Yeah.
And do all of this while the murder of his father hang around him. Adam Czartoryski famously says that Paul's murder loomed over Alexander like a vulture.
Yeah.
Whenever he went, and wherever he did,
yeah,
the shadow of the events of March, were with him.
It's almost like a Macbeth, Banquo type thing, where just that ghost is kind of following him around everywhere. Yeah.
I'm actually when I was writing Kutuzov's book, I was kind of comparing it to Claudius in Hamlet, where the Tsar actually Czartoryski speaks also that Alexander frequently saw in his dreams and imagination Paul's mutilated, bloodstained body. To me, this is kind of the very thing from Hamlet, right?
Yeah. It's just interesting like that. But yeah, let's jump into our protagonist now. And all right, he's got this great job. He's now Tsar of Russia. He wants to reform inefficient systems that he's inherited. And somewhat like Napoleon, he's an enlightened leader, right? He's opening universities. He's encouraging literary and scientific work. Do you think he's making the right steps initially?
Yes, absolutely. He's, the first, I would say, 3 years of his reign is absolutely fascinating. Just like, 4 years of Napoleon's rule, the consulate era to me is far more fascinating than what he does later. You mentioned that Alexander is 23 years old.
Yep.
He's, by contemporary standards, very handsome, although he was self-conscious of his receding hairline, and he shows kind of early signs of short-sightedness that will be a bane of his existence for the rest of his life.
Right.
There's he's very intelligent. He well-read. You said already mentioned that he spoke several languages. So, I think the fundamental problem that he faces as a ruler is that he is torn between two really essential things. On one hand, he has the liberal upbringing, liberal education, but then on the other side is the harsh, very stark reality of being an autocrat of a massive conservative empire.
Right.
And so Alexander, therefore, has to navigate these two extremes, these two poles very carefully. he starts by organizing a fascinating institution, sometimes called unofficial committee, sometimes called private committee.
Mhm.
And it was him and a few of his friends, young men,
Yeah.
like Viktor Kochubey, Nikolai Novosiltsev, Pavel Stroganov, Adam Czartoryski,
Yeah.
young men who would kind of get together, sit down, kind of drink a wine or two, and talk about vision that they had for Russia. And this
Right.
is a remarkable vision. It's a vision that talked about profound reform of Russian state
Mhm.
to the degree of that they seriously discussed creating what was referred to as, quote, charter of the Russian people, or
Mhm.
what we will have called constitution. That constitutional document would have introduced profound changes in the state,
Mhm.
would have turned Russia into a constitutional monarchy, and moved it in a direction that would have been very different. I
Right.
mean, this is one of those prospects where you cannot but wonder how Russian history or European history would have turned out if Alex acted on it. But he
Yeah.
understands, and this
And
is
I
the
think,
thing. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think that's great. Especially with domestic reforms, you surround yourself with bright, young, energetic people who want to change things for the better. But I think where he comes into conflict is it's great to have your posse around you and you're working on those things. But in 1805, when you get involved into military affairs, which you don't really know anything about, and you ignore the older generals like Kutuzov or Bennington or whoever, and you just listen to your own sycophants, that's when you get into trouble.
that is a problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem, and we'll see the outcome of it. But between 1801 and 1805, Alexander introduced substantive reforms.
Mm-hmm.
Not the least of them was the beginning of emancipation of serfs.
Right.
That is a fundamental initiative. State-owned peasant serfs are increasingly emancipated.
Yep.
He introduces new universities. Alexander will create ministries,
Right.
and these ministries will kind of consolidate the institutional, the government power, and we'll have a ministry for foreign affairs, for finance, for commerce, and these are the ministries that continue to exist to the present day. So modern day Russian government ministries actually trace their origin
All
to
right.
September 1802
So a lasting
manifesto.
institution. Yeah, that he developed. Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's good. That's progress right there.
Absolutely. And I think, the reform of the Senate, for example, yet another kind of important initiative that he brings, or the permission in 1801, in late 1801, where Alexander signs a decree allowing merchants and petty bourgeois to buy land and own
Mhm.
land. Again, very, very important.
Mhm.
So there are important incremental changes that Alexander is bringing.
Okay.
What he can do, and what he realizes right away, is that he can do immediately the substantive changes, like emancipating all serfs.
Mhm.
Now that was too radical and was shelved, and of course, as we know, will not be implemented until 1860s.
Right.
Nor would he be able to kind of introduce that constitutional reform that he envisioned. He toyed with it, but after many discussions, I think what happens is that this autocratic streak in him prevailed. He understood that he needs that power to govern an empire of the size of Russian state.
Right.
And of course, the third crucial element was the fact that in 1804, 1805, Alexander finds himself engaged increasingly in confrontation with Napoleon.
Yeah.
And it's hard to introduce substantive reforms at home when you're fighting a major war like the War of Third Coalition.
Yeah. And let's talk about that, because I think obviously some people say maybe Alexander should not have gotten involved in that. Maybe British gold prompted him to get involved, or supporting the Austrians. But I think a little bit of it was he was the second most powerful man probably in Europe after Napoleon. And maybe he just wanted to try his hand against this famous guy, this Napoleon. Do you think that was a little bit of it?
I would rank that at the bottom of my list, frankly,
Okay.
because there are several important issues that dominate Russian thinking, and to this, for me, the biggest issue that certainly affects Russian thinking in 1804, 1805 is the unremitting aggrandizement of French power in Central Europe.
Right.
Remember that many, so in the 18th century, Russian imperial house has married or kind of became related to many of the German dynasties, ruling dynasties, right? So Alexander's wife is from Baden. His grandmother is from Anhalt-Zerbst, right? And we can talk about kind of the relationships more, but nonetheless, enough here to say that there are the vested interest Russia has in maintaining its interest in Germany.
Yeah.
But in 1801, starting in 1801, of course, Napoleon is pushing through the restructuring of Germany. That's the famous imperial recess, which will completely reshape the future of Germany.
Yep.
Dozens of German states disappear.
Yep.
Over 3 million people will see themselves moving from one state, allegiance to one state to another.
Yep.
Right. Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, they will be kind of double in size and become far bigger than ever before. And then some smaller states will be affected. Now, all of this comes at the expense of Russian interest. As far as Russia is concerned, France is usurping dominant position in Germany and is pushing Russians out.
Yeah, it's a territory grab, and they don't want to be last to the table.
Yeah,
I get it. Yeah.
The second important issue that I would remind your listeners is what happened in the spring of 1804. Specifically, Napoleon sends troops into neighboring Principality of Baden to detain Louis Antoine Henri de Bourbon, the Duke d'Anjou.
Yep.
And notice the principality, though. Right, D'Anjou resided in Principality of Baden, and where is Alexander's wife from? From Baden.
Yeah.
And what happens now is here the fact is that the French violated the sovereignty of a neighboring state, which happened to be related to the imperial house of Russia.
Right.
Detained a prince of royal blood, moved back to Paris, and cold-bloodedly shot him.
Right.
So for Russia, this is a kind of double whammy.
Yeah, scandalous.
It's not a minor accident that they simply can ignore.
Right. So moving just forward in the story, though, in 1805, we have the war of the Third Coalition get really heated up. Napoleon surrounds Mack at Ulm, and Alexander with Kutuzov is moving his army towards a confrontation with Napoleon at Austerlitz. You and I have talked about this particular battle. Kutuzov had a plan. The Austrians had a plan. Alexander had a plan. What happened there? Why was that battle a huge failure for the Russians and Austrians?
And that's where my finger is pointed squarely at Alexander. He's the culprit.
Yeah.
He screwed it up and screwed it up royally, because on the eve of Austerlitz, he receives advice from Kutuzov, from other senior officers, from Austrian officers, not to fight this battle. And time and again, Alexander overruled his own generals, listened to the Austrian advice, or at least some Austrian advice, and insisted on this battle. We've talked about during Kutuzov's episode that the famous scene with Dolgorukov, Peter Dolgorukov, that young man who went to see Napoleon, right?
Yep.
He comes back, and the impression that Napoleon is weak and scared.
Yep. And
he meets with Tsar upon return, right? And he tells Alexander that you have nothing to worry.
Right.
Napoleon trembled in fear in front of me, Dolgorukov tells him, that it will suffice for our advance guard to move in and defeat him. And Kutuzov is listening to all of this, and he kind of points out that Dolgorukov is being played.
Yeah, duped.
And Dolgorukov apparently sniggers back at him and tells him to, old man, shut up.
Right.
And so Kutuzov then snarls back at him, saying, what are you laughing at, young man?
Right.
And I laugh this kind of, you can imagine this grog, him gnarling at it. It says, maybe you think that I'm a coward.
Yeah.
My age and wounds will speak for themselves.
Right.
And Kutuzov storms out of this meeting.
Yeah.
Dolgorukov stays behind, looks at the Tsar, and tells him, if your majesty retreats, Napoleon will think of all of us as cowards.
Mm-hmm.
And then Alexander kind of gets startled by this, looks at him and says, cowards? Then it is better for us to die.
Mm.
And that, I think that issue of maybe masculinity, honor, perception, prestige certainly plays a role in it. And Alexander, once he's in the fields of Austerlitz, feels that he's capable of confronting Napoleon. As you said, John, he's surrounded by this group of sycophants who've barely not seen even, smelled battle, not to mention command anything.
And we talked about at the very beginning, you gotta surround yourself with people who know what they're talking about. And I think he had too many nobles and friends and sycophants, like you said. But I think also at the beginning I said, he learned a great deal over his career. And I think this failure is a great learning experience for Alexander.
Exactly. And I think that memory stayed with him for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
The memory of humiliation, the memory of feeling helpless, like watching your army, which yesterday you thought would be riding high and straight to the triumph, but watching it being dismantled in such a drastic fashion, right? It's a decisive fashion.
Yeah.
I think that memory stayed with him for a long time.
Yeah.
It is only in 1813 that Alexander will begin once again to assert himself and kind of place himself in decision making affecting the military. But until then, he effectively will withdraw from military affairs and let the professionals do their thing.
Right. And probably a good decision there. Interestingly enough, though, after the loss at Austerlitz, Austria sues for peace, but Russia does not. They stay in the battle. And, Prussia gets involved in 1806. And in 1807, the Russian army they at least battle to a stalemate at Eylau. But later that year, they're decisively defeated by the French at Friedland. And the two sides agree to a peace agreement called the Treaty of Tilsit. Do you want to touch base on what happened at that? Because it was the first time, I believe, Napoleon and Alexander ever met each other, and they were really fond of each other initially.
Yes, but let me kind of mention one thing, and I think that which is important to bear in mind when we talk about Alexander, that in the wake of Austerlitz,
Mm-hmm.
right, he blames the defeat in that war squarely on others.
Mm-hmm.
He takes no responsibility for it.
Right.
And then in 1806, 1807, I think he learns the lesson that he will not be present. That even when he brings the reinforcements in the spring of 1807, he stays at Tilsit and doesn't go to the front line.
Mm-hmm.
He lets the kind of generals do their thing. As you said, Eylau was a bloody stalemate.
Mm-hmm.
And there was all the hope that Russians might be able to turn it around until Bennigsen makes a blunder at Friedland. Outcome is a complete rout.
Right.
So when Alexander and Napoleon meet at Tilsit, Alexander has a weaker hand.
Mm-hmm.
So he has to use his personal charms, so to speak, in order to get out of this conundrum with something to show for it.
Right.
And in charming Napoleon, in showing, kind of playing Napoleon, I think Alexander is very skilled.
Yeah,
he succeeds.
There's that great opening line. Alexander says to Napoleon, "I hate the British as much as you do." And
that's right. Then we have a deal, right?
Right. And Napoleon says, "Well, then we already are at peace." Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, his charm, and I think Napoleon was trying to charm Alexander as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a moment when you see Napoleon deliberately kind of willing to reach out to a defeated power, something that he's not done with Prussians or Austrians, and give Russians a very good deal. Tilsit is the moment when Europe is split into two spheres of influence. Western side, or central and western side, that will be French, and the eastern side that will be Russian.
Right.
Tilsit, Napoleon, even after defeating Alexander, right, allows him, kind of gives him the green light to expand the Russian borders into Finland, accepts the Russian expansion into the Danubian principalities to a certain degree, but nonetheless.
Yep.
He also kind of accepts the Russian claims to Caucasus, where Russia already took over my homeland in 1801. Alexander signed the manifesto annexing Georgian kingdom.
Right.
Well, in 1807 at Tilsit, Napoleon recognizes Russian aggrandizement in Caucasus.
Do you think initially they both meant to honor it, or were they just biding their time to rebuild their armies?
I think it all depends on particular elements of it, because the treaty, I think, was meaningful to both sides. We know that right after the treaty, Alexander sanctioned the invasion of Finland and the war against Sweden. We also know that the treaty helped Russians to kind of try to consolidate their presence in Caucasus and the Danubian Peninsula.
Right.
But what the biggest stumbling block, I think, in the relationship was the question of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Because Tilsit, especially secret provisions, spoke about possibility of partitioning it, and partitioning would have been exactly what the Russians wanted for quite some time.
Right.
But Napoleon, in later years, was very apprehensive about that.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of pissed off Alexander, since the promise was made at Tilsit. And this next big issue, the one that is really running like a red line through all of relations, is of Poland. Poland was destroyed by Russia in three partitions between 1772 and 1795.
Yeah.
Then Napoleon restored the kernel of Polish sovereignty, right, at the Duchy of Warsaw.
Yep.
In 1807, 1808. And that creates the kind of fear in Russia that Napoleon might encourage Polish restoration. And if that happens, then Russia has to forsake significant territories to the revived Polish state. And so throughout 1809, 10, 11, one of the biggest issues of debate between Russians and French is the future of Poland.
Yeah. I think also the adherence to Napoleon's continental system was something Alexander probably initially tried to do, but I think it was too hurtful to his economy.
Here, I think I would kind of flip the sides, because you're right that continental system affected adversely Russian economy. But what I kind of struggle to justify is Napoleon's insistence on maintaining strict blockade when he himself, in 1811, starts issuing licenses that allow French, for example, commercial interests to import British produce. So he's relaxing continental system when it comes to French-controlled territory,
right,
but doubling down on Russians protecting their own economic interests.
Right.
And I think that's where Napoleon should have been more practical about dealing with Russia.
So in 1812, Napoleon finally invades Russia, captures Smolensk, and then more shockingly, Moscow. Do you think the Tsar ever thought about making a peace accord with Napoleon?
The short answer is no. And I think this decision that Napoleon makes to go into Russia is one of the fundamental mistakes he makes. Actually, I would say the most important, the most crucial mistake that he makes. And part of this mistake is him underestimating, really underappreciating Alexander's character and resolve. And it shows when he gets to Moscow, right? That underestimation again plays out again, because Napoleon keeps sending messages to St. Petersburg, to Alex, asking to negotiate, but he should have known better, both from the conversation with the Caulaincourt, his ambassador to St. Petersburg, and to the other people who knew Alexander, that there was no prospect for peace. Alexander told him repeatedly on the eve of the war that if this war begins, it will be the war that will last until one of the side falls. And of course, he famously promises that he will not negotiate or accept any conditions as long as a single soldier, French soldier, was on the Russian soil, and that he would be ready to retreat all the way to Kamchatka and keep fighting rather than to accept any conditions.
Right.
And Alexander, it's not just about his character. That is, of course, part of the Russian kind of reasoning of it. He's genuinely determined to fight, but it's also that he is in a situation when I don't think he had another choice, really. In my mind, and I have very little doubt in this, and again, you're welcome to disagree, but in my mind, very little doubt that Alexander would have shared the fate of his father.
Got it.
So, and I'm sure he knew that. So
Right.
it's both his internal kind of determination to fight on, but also the wider situation in which there is a resolve on the part of the Russian populace, certainly the resolve on the part of the Russian elite to keep fighting. And so those overtures, those the peace requests that Napoleon says are rebuffed, and the war continues throughout 1812, leading to ultimately, as we all know, to the great catastrophe of the Grande Armée. That is forced to leave Russia with barely 1/10 of its strength.
I have one more question, though, about the invasion. Obviously, in 1805, Alexander's relationships with his generals were complicated at best. In 1812, had he learned, like, all right, maybe I should let the generals handle it. I don't need to be at the front. Do you think he was more, I guess, educated by that point in his relationship with his generals?
I think the answer is not as clear-cut as we may wish it. So to start with, when the war began, Alexander was with the army, and under the Russian military statute, he effectively could exercise the supreme command.
Right.
And certainly his presence hampered the decisions of the Minister of War and the commander of the biggest Russian army, Mikhail Barclay de Tolly. And Alexander stays with that army for a couple of weeks until he's kind of he's told that, hey, you need to leave. That in order for the military men to do their thing, they can't have you here around because your presence is inconvenience. And so he smartly leaves. I think that's big decision on his part to say, to resist the temptation of taking charge and leave and allow Barclay de Tolly to implement what was a very unpopular but a very kind of rational and effective strategy of retreat. Then we of course know that strategy resulted in Barclay de Tolly's removal and the appointment of Kutuzov. And once again, I think Alexander resists that temptation of getting involved, where when he appoints Kutuzov, he gives him not simply the command of an army, but he appoints him as the supreme commander of all Russian forces. So centralize the authority in the hands of a capable, experienced general, and then gives him a wide latitude to pursue operations decisions, right, that will let Russia win, so that Kutuzov doesn't have to constantly check with Alexander for permission.
Right. Yeah.
All that, John, kind of changes once it becomes clear that Napoleon has been defeated in Russia. He's been ousted. Once the Russians reach the imperial borderland, Kutuzov and his people are kind of shuffled aside, and Alexander increasingly kind of takes the lead role in the army.
Right. And let's talk about that. by 1813, Napoleon has been evicted from Russia, and the Tsar is the leading force in uniting the Allies. Kutuzov dies in 1813, so you're right. Alexander's kind of not only the commander in chief, but he's leading at the front again. Do you believe his influence was the ultimate factor in Napoleon's downfall in 1814?
Yes, I do. Alexander is a prime architect of the coalition. He's the driving force behind it. Of course, he would have been unable to achieve that triumph without the close collaboration or cooperation with Austrians and Prussians.
Mm-hmm.
But at the key moments, like in the late spring of 1813, when the coalition suffered two major defeats, right?
Yep.
Alexander insists on fighting on.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, right, it's the Russian army that represents the bulk of the troops that are confronting Napoleon time and again. And so I think he is key ultimately to the transformation that will take place in Europe in 1813, 1814.
Yeah, and I think coalition building is something he's pretty good at. Not only does he bring former Marshal Bernadotte onto his team, but he also brings General Moreau, who was a rival of Napoleon. He brings aboard Jomini, who was a chief of staff of Ney. So he's bringing like really talented advisors to his side in this point.
He does, and I think maybe let me flip the coin. Maybe it's Napoleon who is so keen on pissing off people, and making Alexander's job easy.
True. That's a good point.
Because one of the things you cannot but wonder is what would have happened, right, if Napoleon had listened to Metternich during the conversation he was having with him in the summer of 1813, and when he was offered what I think were rather sensible offers. Yes, offers that would have resulted in a significant reduction of French imperial presence in Europe. But that's what happens when you lose a war as spectacularly as he did in Russia. So I think Napoleon had actually time and again had an opportunity to strike a deal, either separate deal with the Austrians or a more comprehensive deal with the Allies that might have played it out in his favor. But as it was, Alexander I think was able to keep the coalition together with Metternich, with King Frederick William of Prussia, and push it to the triumphant conclusion. Right, Napoleon is defeated at Leipzig, which to me is the most important battle in the second half of the imperial era. Far more important than Waterloo. And I say that with apologies to my British friends. It's the Leipzig that really decides the future, the destiny of Europe, rather than Waterloo.
Napoleon abdicates in April 1814, and there's a quote I want to get to because I think it really speaks to the enlightened view of Alexander. He could have been very harsh on the French, especially after the destruction of Moscow and Smolensk. But he takes a more liberal view, especially when he walks into Paris. The quote is, "I do not come as an enemy. I come to bring you peace and commerce," end quote. The Parisians cheered. One Frenchman replied, "We've been waiting for you for a long time." And Alex replied, "If I didn't come sooner, it is the bravery of the French troops that is to blame."
Yeah, you gotta love it.
But he could have. By the time of the Congress of Vienna and Napoleon's defeat, he's the most powerful sovereign in Europe, perhaps the world. Why is he not harsh on the French, do you think?
Part of it is a calculation. It's a cold calculation. He's like Napoleon. He's a very good kind of political operative. He understands how to talk, kind of to pull the strings on the French hearts and kind of how to win the French hearts and minds. He's every kind of step, every decision he makes in March and April of 1814 designed to kind of cultivate that image of him as the benevolent conqueror, and he's quite successful at this. The Russian the Russian troops in France and in Paris were all instructed to behave well, not to commit any transgressions. And I've written on the Russian presence in Paris, and it's a meeting of two very kind of unique cultures and different ways of doing things, and certainly for many Russian soldiers and officers, this is the first time ever they've been this far outside Russia. So this is encountering a unique kind of for them, it's a unique cultural experience as well.
Right.
And Alex, now that he's victorious, right? Now that he's riding at the top of the world, certainly is keen on maintaining that perception of him as you said, the most powerful man in Europe. I'm not sure about the world. I think that the British might take an issue with that.
Yeah. Good point. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, in Europe, for sure.
But there is also an interesting aspect to it, and that is, this is a period when Alexander also undergoes this religious awakening. We've talked about his early kind of liberal upbringing, and I think the liberalism of his early days is increasingly forgotten now. And what I mean by this is that in 1814-15, in this period, he is encountering what we call mystic pietism, cultivating this vision that he didn't win just because of the sacrifice of his people, sacrifice that other nations made, but rather because he was chosen by God to bring down the revolution incarnate.
Like it was God's will.
Exactly. And I think that religious messianism becomes an important element in Alexander's kind of worldview, that this was a part of a larger plan.
Let's talk about that. Post 1815, after Napoleon's second abdication, he becomes increasingly suspicious of those around him. He's more withdrawn and more religious. Is he worried about assassination, or is he just wants to, he's been basically on campaign for how many years fighting the French in other countries as well. Is it just, like you said, he's more religious, or why does he kind of become more withdrawn in his later years?
I do want before we talk about that, I do want to point out the fact that Alex was kind of talking about his benevolence. The decision to send Napoleon to the island of Elba is largely made at his behest. So for whether it was a smart decision or not, I think it reflected his view that Napoleon, that he still maintained certain level of respect for Napoleon, grudging but nonetheless. Of course, it backfired, right? Spectacularly.
But no, I think he had great respect. I remember when Marshal Oudinot got his baton, I know Alex sent him a letter of congratulations. So I think he had great respect for the entire French army.
Yes, I think so. And now that Napoleon is defeated and he's surrendered to the British, and it's the British who make a decision to exile him to the far away island. Alex plays a crucial role in the Congress of Vienna, and here we see him as a pragmatic politician, as a diplomat, as this head of the state that is keen on maximizing its advantages and benefits. And ultimately, Alexander is able to get away with most of what he wanted. And look how well he played his cards, in that through relationship with Napoleon, he was able to acquire Finland, right? The Treaty of Tilsit, Treaty of Erfurt. And that acquisition was confirmed at the Congress of Vienna. So Finland remains in the Russian Empire until the collapse of the Russian Empire in the 20th century. At Congress of Vienna, Alexander was able to gain Poland. And of course, it's Congress of Vienna also approved Russian acquisition of Bessarabia from the Turks, and the Russian conquests in Caucasus. So ultimately, if you look in terms of territory, Russia came out the best out of Napoleonic powers. Powers engaged in Napoleonic wars.
And I don't think he gets enough credit for his diplomatic skills. I mean, you're matching wits with some of the greatest diplomats of all time: Metternich, Talleyrand, The British, I know, had diplomats there, so it wasn't an easy thing to do, and I think he should get more credit for his diplomatic skills.
Yes, to a degree, I think you're absolutely right. You're right that Russian diplomats, and Alexander is well advised by a group of capable, experienced diplomats. Not the least of them is Karl Nesselrode, who is unheralded, usually kind of shoved into the corner of historical discussion. But I want to shout out to him. But these advisors do help him shape the European future, certainly a Russian future, by insisting on concessions to Russia, and ultimately, as I said, they got most of what they wanted.
Okay, well, let's wrap up then. I know there's a 10-year period from 1815 to his death in 1825 that I want to talk about, but I also want to talk about kind of the mystery behind his death in 1825. So can we kind of dive into that for a little bit?
Absolutely, and I think that post 1815 period is one of the most interesting and complex periods as far as Alexander is concerned. He remained in charge of the Russian Empire for another 10 years, but I think these last years are full of disillusionment and disenchantment, which is a startling thing to say about a guy who just defeated Napoleon.
Yeah.
Who in 1815 is at the top of the world.
But you wonder, like, he just witnessed all that death and destruction for, 10 years. And, his country and his army was probably ravaged somewhat. So maybe that's why, I don't know, maybe he was just he found religion as, like you said, it was God's will, but maybe he's just trying to make sense of it all. Like, why did I have to go through all that?
To me, in the kind of the understanding I have gained from reading the contemporary writings is that the victory over Napoleon, this really defining experience for so many people, have left. It had left an imprint on Tsar's mentality.
Mm-hmm.
We already talked that he was enthralled by religious mysticism, but part of that religious mysticism was also his kind of transformation from a reform-minded liberal figure to a more conservative figure.
Mm-hmm.
So in the post-1815 period, now that this revolution incarnate is defeated, Alexander actually seeks to uphold conservative order, and the conservative order for him is the order that is based on Christian ideals.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander in this post-1815 period becomes everything that as a young man he loathed,
mm-hmm.
which I mean, that's probably the worst thing you can experience, right?
Yeah.
So we see him doubling down on these conservative tendencies to such a degree that by 1820s there is an open, vociferous criticism of him, and one of his close companions, Rodion Kashelev, famously notes that everyone, old man, middle-aged man, young, and he says actually especially young, everyone condemned Alexander and for the conservative policies that he pursued.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is the fact that when Alexander led those Russian armies all the way to France,
mm-hmm.
as we've mentioned, he exposed thousands of Russian officers, and I'm not talking about the kind of rank and file, but it's the officers drawn from the elite. He exposed these thousands of officers to a new way of life. He let
mm-hmm.
them see how people live in Germany, how they live in France. And I just translated a memoir of one of these officers. You can see him kind of marveling when he's in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that these Germans live so much better than us?
Mm-hmm.
How is it? I mean, there's a passage where he says, German peasant lives better than a Russian gentleman.
Yeah.
How is it, right?
I can imagine when they got to Paris, their minds were probably blown. They're like, oh,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, we know that quite a few Russian actually soldiers deliberately stayed behind because they prefer to live in France.
Yeah, hard to blame them. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a beautiful city.
And when this young man, these officers returned back, they became engaged in secret societies,
mm-hmm.
liberal secret societies that were discussing ways they can improve life in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, increasingly, the answer is to embrace these liberal reforms, kind of emancipation, change, some of it would be not unlike the one that France went through.
Right.
But of course, in a conservative society like Russia, these secret societies could not openly operate, and so we have kind of this brewing of intellectual turmoil within Russia that takes place 10 years.
Okay.
And so ultimately, I think by the time Alexander actually dies in 1825, when he looks around, right, I think he sees a reality that is in direct contrast to the early aspirations that he had as a young man.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that just to wrap up. I know he passes in 1825. Can you talk to us about the mystery behind his death? I know there was conspiracy theories that maybe he didn't die. He was like a monk in a monastery.
When I talk to my students, that's usually the place where their minds are blown. So the official story is that in 1825, Alexander decided to travel to a small town on the Azov Sea called Taganrog, and that he was not kind of feeling well, and he decided to go. And then while in Taganrog, he contracted disease, usually claimed to be a typhus, and effectively died kind of within a week, so very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And then his body was placed, because Taganrog is on the Azov Sea, and Moscow, not just Moscow, St. Petersburg is over 1,000 miles to the north. They put his body in a sealed coffin and transported back to the capital. And that would have been essentially it, except there are some issues with this official storyline. So to start with, we know that later on, much later on, when the Bolsheviks took over in 1917, they one of the first things they did is they went through the imperial tombs, opening them up to strip the bodies of their possessions. Any jewels, any kind of rings that they had. Mm-hmm. And as far as we can say, certainly the report from that opening ceremony was that when they opened Alexander's tomb, that it was empty. So that's it by itself is a big problem, right?
And I'd also like to point out his official age of death. He was only 47. He was a young guy.
He's very young. Yeah, considering that I'm 45, I would say he is very young.
Yeah.
Another, of course, issue is that after Alexander's passing in 1825, shortly thereafter, we know that there was a hermit, not necessarily a monk, but a hermit that appeared, Fyodor Kuzmich, who traveled around Russian countryside and kind of lived the life of a wandering hermit. Mm-hmm. Now, because in Russia the movement of the population was tightly controlled, hermit was repeatedly detained and interrogated. On several occasions, he was actually punished with he was whipped. Mm-hmm. for the transgression. But during these detentions, they discovered that he was in possession of items with Alexander's personal insignia. Mm-hmm. Right. So how could a humble, poor, wandering hermit, right, who has nothing but just a few possessions, have personal possessions of an emperor himself? The surviving evidence suggests that this hermit spoke fluent French, had knowledge of German and other languages, that he showed remarkable knowledge of the royal court, and that caused some to question his identity. Right. We also know that later on in 1840s, I think 1830s, members of the Russian imperial family traveled east to visit this hermit in a remote monastery. Mm-hmm. Again, why would a member of the family travel that far to visit a nobody, right? Right. And within the Romanov family, by the time we get to Nicholas II, right, there was this understanding that Alexander indeed faked his death and kind of spend the remaining few years of his life in atoning for his past transgressions. Some of it would have been atoning for his father's murder. Some of it will be kind of living the life of that religious mysticism that was so appealing to him in the aftermath of defeating Napoleon. But Fyodor Kuzmich, this hermit, had a long life. He dies in January of 1864. So that is incredible. Especially what is interesting is that he was actually canonized later on by the Russian Orthodox Church. So right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's government announced that it intends to open the tomb of Fyodor Kuzmich to do DNA testing. They haven't done it yet, but I cannot wait for that moment when they do, because if it's proven that this is Alexander, I mean, this would be one of those remarkable discoveries.
That's almost like the Marshall Ney escaping to America theory. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So, do you think like a 10% chance, 40%?
Yes, I certainly have my fingers crossed.
Well, I think that'd be fascinating. So we'll have to do a follow-up when we find the DNA results.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, my friend, for joining us, and always a pleasure. And yeah, I learned a lot. I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.